Welcome to Vitamin OC. I'm Joanna Weiss.
And I'm Whitney Gomez. Every week we bring you your recommended dose of civics and civilization in Orange County. And today we are stepping back from the nonstop headlines to think about where these headlines come from, how America's news system got to where it stands today. The rise of cable television to the explosion of social media, the way Americans consume information has changed dramatically. Trust in the media has declined. Local newspapers have disappeared, and many people now get their news through platforms designed to maximize attention rather than promote understanding. We have a nationally renowned guest with us today to explore how ratings, corporate ownership, and digital media transform journalism and what those changes mean for democracy, political polarization, and everyday communities like Orange County.
Today, we're joined by University of Pennsylvania professor Dr. Victor Pickard, one of the nation's leading scholars on journalism, media policy, and the future of American news. Dr. Pickard is the C. Edwin Baker Professor of Media Policy and Political Economy and co-directs the Media, Inequality, and Change Center at Penn's Annenberg School for Communication. He is the author of several influential books, including his 2020 book, Democracy Without Journalism, which emphasizes the structural nature of journalism's collapse. Dr. Pickard's work focuses on the decline of local news, media consolidation and corporate ownership, public funding for journalism, misinformation, and the relationship between media systems and democracy. Professor Pickard, you are a leading voice examining whether our current media system still serves the public interest. And welcome to Vitamin OC.
Thanks so much for having me.
Professor Pickard, you've been writing about the collapse in American journalism for 15 years, and it was a little frightening to go back and see how long you have been ringing the alarm on this. To set the table for our discussion, can you please take us back to the way American media and news was structured before this most recent problematic period? What was in place then that kept news objective, useful to citizens, and in the eyes of most Americans neutral?
Thanks, Whitney. It's a great question. I'll take just a couple minutes to sort of lay the table for our broader discussion. Because we really, to understand how we got to where we are today, we of course have to turn to history. And I would say in particular, a couple of inflection points that would be useful to look at. And for our print media, we really need to look at the 80s, the 1880s, to understand how we arrived at this point, how our print media developed in a particular way. And what happened in the 1880s is that our newspapers became more reliant on advertising revenue. They became more driven by the kinds of profits that they were able to generate from delivering audiences to advertisers. And before that, it had been more of a mixed revenue model. You had some support coming from advertisers, some support coming from political parties. That's why they called it the partisan press era. You also had support from readers, like everyday readers like us. And you had support from even the government that was giving them massive subsidies through postal subsidies to the tune of tens of billions of dollars in today's currency. So you had a very blended revenue stream. And this meant that you had a different kind of media than you have today. The long story short, from the 1880s to now, is that we saw our print media, that is our newspapers, become hyper commercialized. And then in turn, there was a reaction to that. Many of your listeners and viewers probably heard of the yellow press era. And that was when essentially it was the clickbait of the 1890s, early 1900s, when basically newspapers were doing everything to capture people's attention, to sell them to advertisers. And they would make things up sometimes, what we have called in more recent parlance, fake news. So there was a reaction to that, and eventually journalists professionalized and they became much more objective. They learned that, in order to maintain the public trust, they had to be socially responsible. I would never say that it was a perfect model, but it was based on this idea that there were professional journalistic ethics that all journalists had to adhere to. And that's what we've seen come apart in more recent years, especially as this advertising dependent revenue model that I'm sure we will talk about later really began to come apart in the early 2000s. So now even this kind of surface level, at least, of being objective, being balanced, being fact-based. I mean, again, some of these journalistic norms are not ones that we want to see go away. So this was a kind of compromise with a very commercial press and maintaining a profitable business model, but also trust from the public. And that worked for many decades and has, or to some degree it worked anyway, and then it came apart. For our broadcast media, we need to look at the 1930s. That's when the American system went down this commercial path instead of having a strong public broadcast system like most democratic countries. And in the United States, we didn't develop a public broadcasting system until the late 60s. And of course, that was recently defunded by the Trump administration and by Congress last year. So we really have all these structural problems. And throughout the decades, throughout the nights, there was this attempt to try to have kind of regulation. Like if we're going to have this hyper commercialized media system, we have to have some regulations in place to keep them somewhat conscientious of their democratic duties. And that's where we had things like the fairness doctrine that, again, I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of, but that was thrown out in 1987 during the Reagan administration. And that's what really mandated that broadcasters cover stories in, from diverse perspectives, from many, sort of a balanced or at least a diverse political spectrum, and do so in a balanced manner. And that was thrown out again in the 80s. So these are the kind of policy decisions that led us to where we are today.
Thank you for that. That background is incredibly helpful for kind of painting the picture of where we've come from. And a major theme in your scholarship is the argument that democratic societies need strong, independent journalism systems that aren't driven by commercial profit motives, where you were talking about the advertising. If we start at the local level, where do you have concerns about the decline of local newspapers, or is that mostly an economic development, or is there more to it?
There is more to it, but it is predominantly an economic problem. And the crucial detail that I didn't mention before when I said that they became so dependent on advertising revenues, it was as high as 70 to 80%, sometimes even more for major newspapers, that they relied on advertising for all of their funding to support any level of journalism. And this was kind of the natural order of things for about 125 years. And the lazy narrative is that the internet came along and that just killed journalism. Or sometimes you hear Craigslist get blamed. There went the classified ads because suddenly they're free online. Now, there are grains of truth to all this, but I would really frame it as this over-reliance on advertising revenue. They were just so inordinately dependent on that revenue stream so that when readers and advertisers migrated to the web, newspapers lost their monopolistic position within their given markets. Before that, if you wanted to advertise anything, whether it was for furniture or shoes or clothing, you generally had to go to your local newspaper. So they had this kind of monopolistic position. But once everyone started going online, they lost that position. And digital advertising pays pennies on the dollar to traditional print advertising. And most of that money is going to Facebook, Google, increasingly Amazon. So these big digital players are hoovering up all the digital advertising revenue. So this model has just exploded. It's never coming back. And since the early 2000s, we've lost 40% of our newspapers, 75% of our newspaper journalists. Early 2000s, you had 40 journalists per 100,000 people. Today, you have 8.2 journalists per 100,000 people. And this has led to tens of millions of Americans living in what are called news deserts, where they have access to little or no local news media whatsoever. So this is a huge, huge problem for all of us. We all learn in school that democracy requires a free and by implication, a functional press system. And we're seeing that being actively dismantled by the market, by these kind of commercial logics that basically say, if you're not profitable, you just have to wither away. It might be a shame, but there's nothing we can do about it. And that's what we really have to change as we try to confront the local journalism crisis.
When we're talking about local newspapers and the dearth of that, has those themes also applied to local broadcasting stations? And can you talk a little bit about Sinclair Broadcasting Group and why people should care who owns their local
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's a slightly different scenario. And, one of the reasons why I emphasize newspapers so much is not because I have nostalgia for ink-stained million fingers and I want to just, wrestle through the broadsheets. But it really is because for the most part, even in their beleaguered state, it's the newspaper industry that is our primary source of original news and information for our entire media ecosystem. Now, broadcasters also have a very important role to play. But by and large, they have not been a major contributor to local journalism. There are exceptions to that. There are some public media outlets that do fantastic local journalism. And, there has continued to be some degree of journalism coming from broadcasters. But a lot of that has been cut back, less because of the advertising issue and more because of just like these corporations that are conglomerating and exerting more and more profit pressures on their local stations so that they really have cut most of their journalists. It's mostly commentary or syndicated content. And I think Sinclair is sort of the poster child for this kind of business model where they're one of the largest local television broadcasters, owners of television broadcasters in the country. And they essentially go in, buy up newsrooms, cut the actual journalists, focus mostly on just commentary and, just conversation, if that. And of course, with Sinclair, which makes it even extra villainous, is that they are extremely right-wing. So they really push a far-right political agenda. They ask their anchors and news commentators to, to basically mimic these scripts that have been handed down from up on high. And I'm sure some of you and some of your listeners have seen those like infamous clips. I think maybe John Oliver did a show on this or something where like 100 anchors are all saying the same script. It's terrifying because even if that weren't far right commentary, to just have that at all, to have any kind of formulaic commentary, political commentary like that, amplified and pumped out of all these different local outlets that are masquerading as these independent news organizations, that's dangerous for any semblance of democratic society.
Yeah, that was such, I remember when those, I think it must have been John Oliver when he publicized that and put those, spliced together all the broadcasters. That was chilling when that was happening. And can you talk about how the ownership structure of the local broadcast stations impacts issues like the recent boycott of Jimmy Kimmel?
Yeah. So, what we're seeing, it's again, one of those things that are during normal times are somewhat invisible to most people. But when we're living through this period of growing authoritarianism, suddenly people are very concerned about our media and who owns our media and what are the policies that are dictating these kind of media ownership structures. And again, all these things are political decisions. They weren't inevitable. They aren't simply natural. And in the case of, the Jimmy Kimmel episode and, even we could talk about Stephen Colbert, there are so many of these cases where the parent corporate owner of these news organizations, whether we're talking about Disney owning ABC or we're talking about Paramount Skydance owning CBS and now possibly CNN as well. So, this is where oftentimes these corporate owners are worried about mergers and acquisitions and whether they're going to get regulatory approval. And what we've been seeing during especially the Trump 2.0 era that we're in right now is that many of these media owners will do almost anything to curry favor with the Trump administration so that they get their mergers passed through, and they will exert pressure on local broadcasters to carry, or to not carry particular programming. So that's what we're really seeing. What we're dealing with are these symptoms, these surface level symptoms, whether it's Jimmy Kimmel or Stephen Colbert, to these deeper structural problems around media ownership and these media oligarchs that are very friendly with the Trump administration, we might say.
Before this year, I think the average person had heard of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, but certainly had never expected to see it so prominently in the news and so prominently used as a political tool. Can you just give us some historical context on the FCC and how the role has changed and how its use as a political tool has been changing?
Yes, so that's such an important question. And all of us, anyone who's living in the United States right now, should know the name Brendan Carr, who's the chairman of the current Federal Communications Commission. But to really understand how bad things are now, again, you need to look at history. And I mentioned earlier that to understand what happened to our broadcast media, we need to look at the early 1930s. And that is when there was the Communications Act of 1934, which established the Federal Communications Commission that was meant to be our major regulatory agency overseeing our broadcast media and our telecommunications media. So that's their major purview. And that part has remained pretty consistent throughout, all the decades. But what's completely different right now, I'm really completely unprecedented, is that the FCC was always mandated to not censor. They could not be a media censor. They really had to be completely content neutral. They could have certain requirements. I mentioned the fairness doctrine before. That's an example of where they basically said for broadcasters to hold on to their licenses to the public airwaves, because the public airwaves is a public resource. We all own it, but we typically give over monopolistic rights to these broadcasters. In the early days, it was really a duopoly of CBS and NBC, and basically said, here, you guys dominate the public airways, but we're going to have a few light regulations in place, like the fairness doctrine. But the FCC was meant to be a neutral arbiter throughout all this. What we're seeing today under Brendan Carr is that the FCC has been weaponized to basically carry water for the Trump administration and to basically go after media organizations if they're not towing the line, if they're not echoing Trump's preferred narratives and talking points. Donald Trump wants as much of the media to sound and look like Fox News as possible. And so Brendan Carr has quite shamelessly promoted this agenda. I mean, he's basically even said he wears a Trump lapel pin, and he has said things in the media that, he's very comfortable with being accused of supporting Donald Trump, even to the point where he says they are not an independent agency. And that, again, is unprecedented. We've always said that these regulatory agencies were independent from the White House, from whichever party happened to be in power. And that has changed today. And again, very troubling for democratic society.
And speaking of weaponization of federal agencies by the Trump administration, along the same theme as the FCC, the administration has brought lawsuits against several media outlets for doing what appears to be historically pedestrian journalistic practices protected under the First Amendment. The administration has sued the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, ABC News settled a case for $16 million. Paramount CBS settled a suit for about the same amount. Of course, we have the FBI head suing the Atlantic. It's been a circus of lawsuits. Beyond bald attempts to intimidate the press, how are you seeing these lawsuits?
Well, first and foremost, I, of course, see them as deeply troubling, deeply anti-democratic, anti-American, really. But, they are frivolous lawsuits, and they should be seen as part of this broader attack on the media. So this is just one other tool that they're using to try to discipline the media, police the media, keep them in line. And more than anything, and something we always have to remind ourselves, that it's easier to see what's being covered, what's being misrepresented in the media compared to what's not being covered, what stories we aren't hearing, because the media are being so attacked. And there is this kind of chilling effect that journalists are basically, it's impressed upon journalists that there are certain issues that are off limits, certain things that they can't cover. And I think those lawsuits are one of the clearest and one of the more egregious methods of the Trump administration trying to do that. Another way that I often characterize this, many people have been hearing about Viktor Orban in Hungary, which, it's been reported widely. And of course, we know that Viktor Orban recently lost, is no longer in power, but he was for many, many years, and he served as an inspiration to many political conservatives in the United States. And I think this is especially clear with the Trump administration's media strategy, because like Viktor Orban, they've realized to take over newsrooms, they don't have to do so at gunpoint. Instead, they can weaponize law and policy and regulatory agencies, and they can rely on friendly oligarchs who are aligned with the Trump administration to police the media for them. So again, this is all part of this broader anti-press package, and the lawsuits are one tool within their toolbox that they're deploying in recent months.
Joanna mentioned Paramount CBS. Bari Weiss is the new editor-in-chief at CBS News. She is saying that she's moving CBS News into the 21st century, but she's come under substantial criticism for editorial interference, and she's been shifting CBS News away from its role as a reliable, neutral source of information. How would you characterize Bari Weiss's moves at CBS?
I think critics, and I'm sure many of your listeners and viewers have heard the criticism. I think it's pretty fair, to be honest. I think, there are some exceptions where CBS is somehow able to continue doing some good journalism. I think that's despite all these problems and all these shifts that Barry Weiss has imposed upon the newsroom. But I think generally speaking, we've seen a lurch to the right. We've seen prominent journalists either be, let go, not their contracts not renewed, or they've resigned out of principle. But I think looking at the bigger picture, they've certainly moved more to the right. They're echoing more of the Trump administration's narratives and talking points. They also eliminated CBS Radio, which, going back to our earlier part of our conversation about broadcast journalists, there were still some. And CBS has played such an important historic role in terms of their broadcast, their radio journalism in particular. And that's something that's been eliminated. So this business model, if we want to call it that, of getting rid of journalism and replacing it with commentary, especially right-wing commentary in this case, it's politically expedient and it's economically quite efficient in terms of generating more profits because journalism costs money. Commentary is very cheap. And I think we're seeing this with CBS under Barry Weiss.
You are on the record saying that the Allisons' purchase of CNN means that we're going to see the same shift at CNN that we're seeing at CBS. And I think you mean more political influence over reporting and the weakening of this expensive, deep, independent journalism. CNN is such an icon of the American media, and I was just absolutely alarmed to hear about this potential change with the Ellisons taking over. How serious is this change at CNN for the availability of verifiable news across the United States?
I think it's very serious. I think we should all be concerned about this. We haven't seen it. The merger hasn't actually gone into effect yet. So there's this, it's kind of like the calm before the storm. But I think we have every reason to assume that under the new ownership, if Paramount Skydance does indeed take over CNN, we will see exactly what happened to CBS happen to CNN. I don't know if they would actually merge the newsrooms, but I think we see a lot of prominent journalists being let go. And indeed, we saw it was reported in the media that the Ellisons were in conversation with representatives of the Trump administration talking about who they would fire if that merger were to go through. So they've been pretty blatant about this whole scheme to hollow out CNN of its actual journalists and try to move it more to the right. And I'm afraid that's exactly what we would see. And it's, CNN it also does tremendous international news coverage as well. And I just think it would be such a blow if this does actually go through.
So I think the three of us really care about CBS and CNN, but a lot of younger Americans get their news primarily from platforms like TikTok, YouTube, or X, formerly Twitter. Do you think these channels are replacing journalism, or are they fundamentally changing what journalism even is?
Yeah, this is such a daunting question, and I get asked this a lot. And in terms of numbers and audiences, more and more people, especially younger people, but just people in general, are spending more time on those platforms and getting news and information more from those sources than they are from traditional legacy news organizations. And that's a fact that we have to grapple with. But I think we have to be absolutely clear-eyed and really articulate the distinctions between what's essentially commentary on these outlets, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but that's not journalism. That's not introducing new facts into the world, into our discourse. It's not fact-checking things. It's not trying to be, again, as we were saying earlier, try to be objective or at least balanced in some way. It's not trying to be very careful editorially and journalistically. So I think, this is a loss of journalism, and it's being replaced by something, but it's not journalism. It's nothing close to journalism. And it's a problem. We have to make sure that there is journalism supported if we want to have a democracy, we're going to have to find a way to support actual journalism. And we can't just rely on influencers and podcasters as much as we love podcasters, but that we need more than that.
Well, you've already somewhat answered my follow-up question to this, was that if social media was the new news channel and every person with an iPhone can put their interpretation of the world in the public domain, how do we keep grasp of what facts and truth are? But I think what you're saying is that only by supporting true journalism are we able to do that?
I think that's fair. I mean, y- it's always helpful to have a great diversity of voices and viewpoints and sources of information. So, that's what we really need to try to maintain. And we're losing that. And oftentimes there's a veneer of that kind of diversity. In fact, a lot of people, and polling data shows this to this day, that the vast majority of Americans have no idea that there's a journalism crisis. They think they're getting more news and information than ever before because there is that kind of surface level, we all are, at our fingertips seem to have endless sources of information, but so much of that is commentary, or what original information is there usually traces back to a legacy newsroom somewhere. They're still, even now, the primary informational feeder for our entire ecosystem. That's something that we just have to be very clear about, and we have to find a way to support that kind of news and information.
One of the recommendations that you've made to solve the media crisis is to have more public funding of journalism. Critics on the right often argue that taxpayer funded journalism could compromise press independence or increase ideological bias on the left. How do you respond to concerns that public funding might make journalism less, not more, independent from political power?
Yeah, I think it's a legitimate concern, actually. Although I would just amend the question to suggest that it's not just critics on the right. I get hit with this a lot from people on the left, or center and center left, who are concerned about newsrooms losing their independence if they were to get public funding. A couple quick points on that. One is that I think the Trump 2.0 era should disabuse us of the kind of independence that we might expect from the commercial media or the independent or the privately owned media. I would say that our public media institutions have actually held up better and have put up more resistance to the Trump administration than our commercial media. So that's point number one. Number two is that if you look around the world and you see the strongest democracies on the planet, of course, the Nordic countries always get trotted out, but really, so many democracies around the planet maintain robust public media systems, and they, again, tend to have healthy democracies. There's actually positive, we have the data to show this. There's positive correlation between a strong public media system and a strong democracy. And of course, the U.S. has been qualified by the Democracy Index for a number of years now as a flawed democracy. We've been experiencing what political scientists refer to as democratic backsliding. So I think we need to take all those things in consideration. But the biggest point is that there's simply no commercial future for certain types of journalism, especially local journalism. So really the stark choice that we're looking at is that we either resign tens of millions of Americans to live in news deserts, or we find some kind of public nonprofit model to support the journalism that democracy requires. And I think there are ways to do this, and we've got, again, data to show this, that you can create a news organization that's publicly supported, but entirely independent from government, that there's no central authority dictating what they cover. There's a way to make sure that it's actually owned and controlled by the communities themselves, by all of us. It sounds very radical, but that's how we run our public education system, actually, for better. That's not perfect, but we do have local control over things. So there are ways to set this up, and I think that's what we're going to have to do.
Along those lines, one of the reasons we started this podcast was to establish a way to communicate with people locally that that we kind of are in control of what messaging gets out in case there are bigger problems with the news networks and they're fully taken over, that we have these outlets that locally. For this is a small piece of the puzzle, but it's something. For people who are listening who want to take action, what can they do? You just named, a big community coming together. Do they buy an outlet of like the Washington Post, like Jeff Bezos did? What can everyday citizens do? What would you recommend?
Yeah, this is always one of my favorite things to talk about, and I'll try to keep it short because there really is a long-term strategy and a shorter-term strategy. The long-term strategy I've already sort of sketched out. We're going to have to create an entirely new public media system from the ground up, and that's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but it's got to be on our long-term political horizon that we're all working towards. But in the meantime, there's so much that we can and should and must do, and that is to support our local journalists however we can, whether it's through donations to our local public media outlets or subscriptions, or supporting podcasts such as yours, these initiatives that are really focused on serving local communities. And also, this sounds somewhat banal, but I think it's important. We have to thank journalists. We have to like appreciate journalists and what they do in our society. It's basically an essential public service. So whenever I talk to journalists, I talk to people like you, I just want to say thank you. You're doing God's work. This is the kind of stuff that we need more of. And yeah, so we really just need to appreciate the role that journalists play, the critical democratic role that they play in our society.
You think about these issues every day, and we've talked a lot about your outlook and the longer term picture and the kind of daunting task in this country of improving journalism over probably decades. Are there solutions that you wish an elected official would implement soon, that someone in Congress or even an executive could implement to bring us back from the brink? Because it really does feel like we are just on the brink of something terrible with journalism in the United States right now.
Yeah, I share your concerns 1,000%. A few things. I mean, there's not going to be one silver bullet that solves all of our problems, right? It's going to have to be a multi-pronged structural media reform project that we need to see come forward. Of course, we need to break up some of the conglomerates. We need to unwind some of this media consolidation that's been happening for many years now, not just under the Trump administration, but we need to build up our public media system, as I keep going on about. But the other thing that we're actually starting to see at the state and local levels in places, we can't expect anything from the federal government anytime soon. But at the state and local levels, we're seeing some fantastic journalistic initiatives. California is doing some really interesting stuff where they're beginning to financially support local journalism. In New Jersey, they have the Civic Information Consortium, which they're also trying to establish here in Pennsylvania. Right now, they're debating it in the state legislature, where government, through a public granting process where it might be universities that are playing a role in this, where they try to allocate public subsidies to the places of highest need, or to assign journalists to particular newsrooms to just cover local journalism, not with any kind of agenda, just like do the journalistic work that's no longer being covered by the commercial sector. And so these kind of public investments that we can make, even we don't have to wait for the next administration in the White House. We could start doing this at the state and local level. And I'm seeing some promising signs on this front. I hope and expect to see more of that.
Professor Pickard, this has been a fascinating exploration of an issue that everyone should care about, especially if you care about democracy. We're so grateful that there are people like you that understand the history of media, understand the problems that are brought today, and spending their scholarship on it. Thank you for thinking of some solutions. We've been honored to have you.
Thanks so much for having me on your show. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm just grateful that you all are having these kinds of conversations.
And we are deeply appreciative of your scholarship. When Joanna and I started talking about the need for this episode, your name came up immediately. And as I noted at the outset, to see how many years you have been talking about this was staggering. So we know you're such an expert, and we really appreciate your willingness to speak up and call people out for things. It's important to be brave right now. We're trying to be brave. You're clearly brave. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Whitney.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for your recommended dose of civics and civilization in Orange County.
We'll see you next time on Vitamin OC.